There is a strange little secret sitting quietly inside the bank accounts of some of the wealthiest women in America, and it has nothing to do with how much money they actually have. It has to do with how much money they are willing to let you see. Somewhere out there, right now, a woman with more zeros in her savings account than most people will see in a lifetime is standing in line at a regular grocery store, wearing a t-shirt that costs less than the coffee you bought this morning, and nobody around her has the faintest idea. Meanwhile, another woman, barely covering her rent, is carrying a bag that cost more than that rent, convinced that the bag is the proof she needed to give the world. One of these women is playing a long game. The other one is playing a very expensive, very exhausting game of pretend. And oddly enough, it is the one who looks poor who usually wins. That is the part nobody wants to admit out loud because it is not a flattering story. It is not the story social media wants to sell you, and it is definitely not the story that keeps engagement rings, designer bags, and luxury car dealerships in business. But it is the truth. And today, we are going to sit with that truth for a while. Picture the version of you that walks into a room and instantly gets read by everyone in it. Not because you tried to be read, not because you said a word, just because of the watch, the bag, the shoes, the way your whole presence seems to whisper, "I have arrived." Now picture a very different version of you. Same net worth, maybe even higher, but nothing about your appearance announces it. You are underestimated in every room you enter. People assume less of you, expect less of you, and sometimes even talk down to you. Which version feels more comfortable? Be honest. Most people, if we are being truly honest, would pick the first one. And that instinct, that small emotional pull toward being seen as doing well, is exactly where this entire conversation begins. Most women believe that once they have money, the natural next step is to show it. Somewhere along the way, we absorb the idea that visible wealth equals real wealth, that success, which cannot be photographed, does not fully count. But many of the women who actually built lasting financial power discovered something almost the opposite. They discovered that the less their lifestyle broadcasted their money, the faster that money multiplied, and the safer their entire life became. Let's slow down here, because this is the hidden truth worth sitting with. Looking poor, or more accurately, looking modest, looking unremarkable, looking like you have nothing to prove, is not a sign of failure. In many cases, it is a form of financial camouflage, and camouflage, if you have ever watched a nature documentary, is one of the oldest survival strategies in existence. Animals that blend in do not get hunted. Women whose wealth blends and do not get hunted either, not by predatory relationships, not by manipulative business partners, not by family members who suddenly remember they exist the moment money shows up, and not by their own ego, which is possibly the most dangerous predator of them all. This is where things become interesting. Think about how differently the world treats a woman who appears to have money versus a woman who appears comfortable but unremarkable. The woman who visibly displays wealth becomes a target in ways she rarely anticipates. She becomes a target for people looking for loans they will never repay. A target for romantic partners more interested in her lifestyle than her personality. A target for jealousy disguised as friendship, and sometimes for a level of resentment so well hidden it takes years to notice its fingerprints on her relationships. The woman who looks financially unremarkable, meanwhile, moves through the world almost unnoticed, and in that invisibility, she finds a strange, quiet form of power. She gets to observe people's true intentions before her money ever enters the equation. She gets to know who actually likes her, not her lifestyle. That is the psychology piece almost nobody talks about. This entire subject is not really about money. It is about fear, protection, identity, and control. A woman who intentionally underplays her financial position is often not doing it out of humility. She is doing it out of self-protection. She has learned, sometimes the hard way, that visible success invites a very specific kind of social vulnerability. Suddenly people have opinions about her spending. Suddenly distant relatives have just one small favor to ask. Suddenly, her romantic relationships develop a strange undertone she cannot quite name, but can absolutely feel. We'll come back to that in a moment, because there is a deeper layer underneath all of this, and it has everything to do with self-worth. Here's a question worth sitting with for longer than you're comfortable with. If nobody could see your bank account, your bag, your car, or your address, would you still feel successful? For a lot of women, the honest answer is uncomfortable because so much of modern female identity has been quietly wired to external validation. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, many women absorb the idea that visible signs of success are proof of worth. The nicer the appearance, the more valuable the woman. It is subtle, it is everywhere, and it is exhausting. The women who eventually build serious, lasting wealth tend to be the ones who unlearn that wiring the earliest. They stop asking, what will this purchase say about me, and start asking, what will this decision do for me in 5, 10, 20 years? That single mental shift, from performance to protection, from image to infrastructure, is often the real turning point in a woman's financial life. Not a raise, not a windfall, a change in what she is actually optimizing for. If you're finding this kind of conversation genuinely interesting, the psychology behind money, identity, status, and the quiet decisions people make every single day, this is exactly what this channel exists for, so go ahead and subscribe. These are the conversations most people never have out loud, even though almost every financial choice we make is secretly shaped by them. Now here is where the emotional stakes start to climb, because looking poor is not just about avoiding attention. It ties directly into something much bigger: freedom. A woman who does not need her appearance to validate her success has an enormous psychological advantage. She is free from the pressure of constant comparison. She is free from needing everyone's approval before she feels secure. She is free from the financial trap of lifestyle inflation, that sneaky little phenomenon where every raise, every bonus, every bit of extra income quietly gets absorbed into a slightly nicer version of the same lifestyle, leaving her no closer to actual freedom than she was 5 years earlier, just better dressed while standing still. Lifestyle inflation is one of the quietest wealth killers in existence, and it disproportionately targets people who feel the need to visibly represent their success. The moment income increases become visible spending increases, the entire financial trajectory shifts from building freedom to maintaining an image. And maintaining an image is a full-time, unpaid job with no retirement plan. This is where the emotional stakes rise even further because we are no longer just talking about money. We are talking about relationships. Consider how differently people approach a woman depending on the signals she gives off. A woman who appears to have significant financial resources often attracts a very specific type of romantic attention drawn to the lifestyle rather than the actual human being living it. A woman who looks financially unremarkable, by contrast, tends to attract people who are responding to her personality, her energy, her values, because there is no shiny surface distracting from the substance underneath. This does not mean visible wealth automatically ruins relationships, and it does not mean modest appearances guarantee good ones. But it does mean that appearance changes the filter through which people evaluate a woman, and that filter has consequences that ripple far beyond a first date. And here is the twist most people never expect when they start pulling on this thread. The women who intentionally choose to look less wealthy than they actually are often report that the biggest transformation in their life was not financial. It was psychological. Once they stopped performing success for an audience, they stopped needing an audience at all. Their confidence stopped depending on reactions from other people and started depending on their own internal sense of security. In other words, the money didn't just quietly build in the background. Their entire relationship with validation rebuilt itself in the process. Let that sit for a second, because it reframes the entire conversation. This was never really about designer bags versus plain t-shirts. It was about where a woman is sourcing her sense of worth from. External sourcing is fragile because it depends entirely on an audience that is unreliable, distracted, and often more critical than supportive. Internal sourcing is durable because it does not evaporate the moment someone stops noticing. There is also a quieter, more uncomfortable layer to this entire subject, and it deserves honesty rather than sugarcoating. Many women who grew up with financial instability learned very early that visible success equals safety, equals respect, equals being taken seriously in rooms that historically did not take them seriously at all. For some women, dressing the part is not vanity. It is armor built from real experience, real dismissal, and real moments of being underestimated. That context matters, and it complicates any simple narrative that says, just look poor and you'll be fine. Life is rarely that clean. But even with that complexity acknowledged, there is a version of financial wisdom that keeps surfacing across countless women who eventually build lasting wealth, regardless of where they started. It is the understanding that appearance is a tool, not a scoreboard. Used intentionally, appearance can open doors, build first impressions, and yes, sometimes signal competence in professional environments where perception genuinely affects opportunity. Used unconsciously, appearance becomes a leash, quietly dictating spending decisions long after the initial motivation has faded into pure habit. The real skill, the one almost nobody teaches, is knowing the difference between strategic visibility and compulsive visibility. Strategic visibility is a woman choosing, on her own terms, when appearance serves an actual goal. Compulsive visibility is a woman spending because the alternative, being perceived as ordinary, feels unbearable. One is a decision. The other is a reaction. And reactions, especially financial ones, rarely lead anywhere good. So where does all of this ultimately lead? Not to a lecture about frugality, and definitely not to some hollow instruction to simply spend less. It leads somewhere much more personal. It leads to a question about identity. Who are you when nobody is watching your spending? Who are you when the bag, the car, and the outfit are removed from the equation entirely? If the answer feels uncertain, that uncertainty is worth exploring because it usually points directly to where financial healing actually needs to happen, not in a spreadsheet, but in self-perception. Because here is the deeper truth sitting underneath every dollar, every purchase, every carefully curated appearance. Money was never just about money. It has always been a mirror, reflecting fear, ambition, insecurity, safety, and self-worth right back at us, often more honestly than we are prepared to see. The women who eventually gain real financial power are not the ones who mastered spreadsheets first. They are the ones who mastered their own reflection first, who stopped asking the world to confirm their value and started deciding it for themselves. Let's push this a little further because there is a financial mechanic underneath all of this psychology, and it deserves its own moment in the spotlight. Every dollar spent on visible status is a dollar quietly removed from the machinery of compounding. It sounds almost too simple to be true, but the math is unforgiving. A woman who consistently redirects money away from appearance and toward assets, ownership, and long-term positioning is not simply saving. She is building an entirely different life trajectory than the woman spending the same income on maintaining an image. 10 years later, one of these women has options. The other one has an impressive closet and a financial situation that looks suspiciously similar to where she started. This is where the emotional stakes escalate again, because we are no longer talking about individual choices in isolation. We are talking about entire life outcomes quietly branching apart from decisions that, at the time, felt small, harmless, even reasonable. A slightly nicer car here. A slightly more expensive vacation there. None of it feels reckless in the moment. It only becomes visible in hindsight, usually around the time one woman is negotiating from a position of financial security and another woman is negotiating from a position of financial dependency, whether that dependency is on a partner, an employer, or a paycheck that disappears the moment life throws an unexpected curveball. And here is an uncomfortable question worth asking honestly. How much of modern female spending is actually driven by personal preference, and how much of it is driven by an audience that was never actually paying that much attention in the first place? Social comparison has a strange, almost cruel irony built into it. Most people are too consumed with managing their own image to spend much time studying anyone else's. Yet so many financial decisions are made as if an audience is watching closely, judging carefully, and keeping score. The truth is far less dramatic and far more freeing. Most people are not thinking about you nearly as much as your anxiety insists they are. This single realization, once it actually lands, tends to change everything. The moment a woman stops performing for an audience that barely exists, her financial decisions start reflecting her actual priorities instead of her imagined critics. Suddenly, spending decisions get quieter, calmer, more intentional. There is less urgency, less impulse, less of that specific financial anxiety that comes from trying to stay one step ahead of a comparison that was never real to begin with. There is also a social dimension worth acknowledging honestly, because relationships between women often carry an unspoken financial subtext that nobody addresses directly. Visible success can unintentionally create distance, discomfort, or quiet competition within friendships, families, and social circles, even among people who genuinely love each other. Nobody wants to admit this out loud, but financial visibility changes group dynamics in ways that are rarely discussed and almost never planned for. A woman who keeps her financial reality private is not necessarily hiding shame. In many cases, she is protecting relationships from a dynamic that money has a strange, persistent habit of introducing uninvited. This brings us to something deeper still, something that goes beyond spending habits and social dynamics into the territory of long-term identity. A woman who builds her sense of self around external validation is essentially constructing her entire emotional foundation on land she does not own. That land belongs to whoever happens to be watching, judging, or comparing at any given moment, and that is an unstable place to build an entire life. A woman who builds her identity internally, rooted in her own values, her own definition of success, her own quiet confidence, is building on land that cannot be repossessed by public opinion, social media trends, or the fleeting approval of people who will forget the interaction within the hour. That distinction, external foundation versus internal foundation, might be the single most important psychological difference between women who eventually experience real financial freedom and women who spend decades working hard without ever quite feeling like they have arrived anywhere. Because real arrival, was never about a bank balance crossing an arbitrary number. It was always about no longer needing anyone else's eyes to confirm that the life being built actually counts. So here is where all of this ultimately lands, past the psychology, past the spending patterns, past the social observations about bags, cars, and appearances that started this entire conversation. Money, at its core, has always been a mirror. It reflects fear back at the fearful, confidence back at the confident, insecurity back at the insecure, and freedom back at the women who quietly, deliberately, stopped asking the world for permission to feel successful. The women who eventually build lasting wealth are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They are usually the ones nobody suspected at all, moving through life unremarkably, invisibly, and entirely on their own terms. And maybe that is the real, quiet revolution hiding underneath a conversation that looks, on the surface, like it's about designer bags and plain t-shirts. It was never really about how poor or how rich a woman appears. It was about whether she needs anyone else's eyes to know exactly who she is.